Man, there's a lot of Sony stuff happening this week, and possibly the most outrageous and unprecedented was the announcement that Concord, the latest live service game from Sony, is effectively closing down. Everybody who's bought the game is going to get refunded, which is astonishing. The game basically disappears. It just stops happening it would have happened by the time you watch this direct. Played some of it last night, but before we talk about the actual game, um, well, I mean, let's just look at these supporter questions. This one from Rubber Nipples 209.
Nice.
Yeah. What is good, DF crew? I'm guessing we're all going to ask about Concord if you have anything to add about it. Todd Weitzel, should I bother getting a sealed copy of Concord on clearance at the big box store to use as an investment vehicle? Well, you've tried that with Lawbreakers, haven't you, John?
Yeah,
How's that investment paying off?
it has not. It has essentially increased in value by about $20.
Okay.
So, so we've come out ahead.
That's fascinating because it has no utility
It has
whatsoever.
zero utility.
Okay.
Zero utility, and that's going to be the same with Concord, by the way. So don't pay a lot for a Concord disc. If I see one for like a reasonable cost floating around somewhere, I'd throw it on my shelf just for kicks, but don't expect it to be a massive investment. Good Lord. This is not that, what is it? NBA Elite 11 or whatever. If you remember that, remember when those got out?
That.
It was a PS360 game from EA. It was the basketball game that they canceled right before launch. And like a few copies got out in the wild, but then they pulled the plug on the whole thing, even though it was ready to ship. I mean, it had shipped. They recalled everything. And it was a finished game, but it's because the demo reception was so bad. There were so many bugs that they just decided to cancel it, even though it was finished. And copies of that routinely go for like, I don't know, like 10 grand or something.
Okay.
So
I'm going to go to you first on this one, Oliver. I mean, this is kind of unprecedented, kind of crazy, but I'm not quite sure what else Sony could have done. What do you what's your take on this? Did you actually play it? You got some experience with the game?
I did not, but I do have to inform John
Okay.
right now that I'm seeing the game go for $150 on eBay here. So
it's going to go down.
Well, hopefully it goes down. I mean, it wasn't in exactly wide it wasn't in wide circulation for a week or so.
Yeah. This is just a minor spike that always happens when these things occur.
Yeah.
It's going to go down.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, it's remarkable. I don't think I've ever, and I have enormous respect for the developers and what they've achieved here. And I think the game itself is not that bad. I think it's actually an all right game, but I've never seen an entertainment product land quite like this. I do think that people seem to like the game online. A lot of people seem to like the game. The reviews weren't amazing, but it didn't seem like it was in the sense that the game itself was like unpolished or didn't have good combat, more in the sense that people are just kind of fatigued of the hero shooter and they have certain expectations from other hero shooters that are really long lasting and other live service games that are really long lasting, that they basically be super polished and super great. And that just is not going to be the case for a lot of these games on day one. So if you have a game come out like Concord that isn't distinguishing itself in a huge way from some of those other titles, like a title like Helldivers 2 might have, you inevitably get compared to those games. And it's not a flattering comparison because a title like Overwatch has 8 years of development behind it. But that obviously is not realistic for a title like Concord on day one to be exactly as well balanced and as well tuned and have the gunplay feeling as tight as a title like that. So I understand that that's tough, but I mean, with titles like these, there are a bit of a roll of the dice. It's tough to predict what will do well. Obviously, Helldivers 2 is a sequel to a top-down indie shooter. Who would have known that would have been a huge success? A title like Concord certainly seems like it would have more mass market appeal attached to it, but it's just tricky. And then it launches and it doesn't even apparently sell 100,000 copies, which is just crazy to me, despite being like a first party Sony title with a ton of promotion. I think they had the opening spot at the June State of Play, right? It was that very first title that people saw. So yeah, I don't know. And I mean, it seemed reasonably priced too. $40 asking price did not seem, I mean, I didn't expect it to do crazily well, based on the early reception and certainly based on John and Tom's impressions from a couple months ago. But I also was not expecting it to do poorly in anywhere near the same league as this appears to have.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts. John, you have played it. Does
Yeah.
this come? I mean, obviously the reaction by Sony, I believe, is unprecedented and possibly, we couldn't have quite predicted they'd go this far. But can you understand why this is happening?
Oh man, it's such a difficult one. I do feel like that state of play thing you mentioned, Oliver, was kind of the canary in the coal mine for this game. Like there was instant negative reactions to this, including from myself. And I think fundamentally, this is a game that it feels cynical, whether it was or not. It feels like a lot of it's like what's there was very much crafted in a boardroom. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's what it feels like. Uh, and that's fundamentally a huge problem for a game like this, because the pool that it's competing in, when you actually break that down, that kind of highlights why I think this failed so spectacularly. First of all, the sort of hero shooter. This is a well-worn genre at this point, and there are still games being played in this genre, and they're pretty much all free to play now. Whether, clearly fans of this type of game have moved to that model. That's what they like. That's what they want. They're happy there. And that also highlights this whole quote unquote forever game thing, where there is a subset of that audience that will just play that game. Something like Overwatch 2, as it is now. People that are playing that will continue to play that game. They're not necessarily in the market for this. If this had been free to play, maybe they'd give it a shot and be like, okay, this is all right, and then play some more. But if you got to jump in, even for $40, it's kind of like what happened with App Store games, where once everything sort of raced to the bottom and hit free to play, like games that cost money up front started to perform worse. It was harder to actually get success in that area because that audience has become used to not paying money up front, right?
Right.
So they're competing in that front. So that already is difficult. Secondly, these games, they are hero shooters. They rely on heroes that people like. And it's pretty obvious that a lot of people do not like the designs in this game. They don't like them. They find them unappealing. You look at that cast and there's nobody that says, yeah, I want to cosplay as that person.
That sounds even the guy that looks like the bloke from Guardians of the Galaxy.
No, it sounds silly, but I think that stuff is actually genuinely important to like creating a fandom around these things, especially when it's a hero shooter where the heroes are a central part of it. If nobody is actually that likable, and instead it just feels like Guardians of the Gallery Great Value Edition, it's, there's nobody's coming to play it from that side either. So with those two things in place, that's a huge challenge, because fundamentally the actual core mechanics, the technology powering the game, they are actually well done, but they're not so well done or unique as to overcome those problems, right? It's like, yeah, it is a competent shooter, but being a competent or even good shooter isn't enough anymore. That just doesn't work. You have to have something else to bring to the table that people genuinely want, and they just didn't do it. There's nothing really special or unique about this that separates it from the pack. That's right there. Like, if there had been some spark, something to grab people, I think they probably thought that those weekly vignettes were part of that, where it sort of tries to add like sort of a narrative angle to it. I bet they looked at something like Blizzard's handling of Overwatch, like the CG stuff that they did for it, and like the way that those characters were kind of viewed in trailers and stuff, and thought, oh, what if we did that, but like actual like more storytelling stuff, and we update it regularly, which sounds kind of cool on paper. I would say it gives you a reason to keep kind of coming back and seeing what's going on there. But again, if the characters aren't that appealing to people, and it just has that cynical made in a boardroom feel. Again, I don't know if that's actually true, but that's the general perception. Like, nobody's going to care about that stuff.
Right. Yeah, I did play the game last night. First time I've played it. Usual situation that you get sort of thrust into matchmaking, where I was, a level 1 character up against level 50 characters. But everything you just said is correct, John. I think this is a really good game at the basic level, but it's just not compelling. It's not a Helldivers scenario where you actually felt like you were engaged in something different and fun. It was just kind of like a really good example of a hero shooter, but if I wouldn't pay $40 for it, I think is the bottom line. Um, I guess I had fun with it. I found the characters to be okay, but I can't really remember any of them
No.
apart from the girl in the massive suit and the Guardians of the Galaxy guy. Looks like Michael Rooker from Guardians of the Galaxy, but with it is kind of like Street Fighter 2 out costume. But yeah, beyond that, it just didn't really grab me. But I do actually think the weapons were really interesting. The gameplay was quite fun, but it just didn't do anything new and it didn't do anything exciting. And obviously now we can actually juxtapose this against Helldivers 2, which
Yep.
was wildly successful because it actually ticked the boxes of how to stand out. It was original and distinct in its own way. It was fun. It was funny. Stuff happened in game that had us howling. Right? It's just really, really fun.
It felt organic though. Like it
Yeah.
felt like the guys that made it were having a great time making it, and it didn't feel like the stuff around it was manufactured so much. It's like they just created a cool game that did some funny stuff, and people liked playing it with
Yeah.
their friends.
And I think there were
Right.
some issues with that game in terms of the balance. There were some issues with some things that were a little glitchy, a little wonky, but it was such a new and fresh experience and so exciting. I've certainly played a lot of Helldivers 2 with my friends. It's a very different style of game, and I think that really attracted people instead of just being like, well, here's another version of a game you've played before, but just not with 10 years of development behind it, which is a harder proposition to sell.
Well, I would also say that polishing and balancing games to perfection is not a good thing. People always talk about balance.
Yeah.
I think there is something to be said.
I mean,
for a game
Helldivers
that's
is
a little
PvE.
scraggly.
Yeah, so
It is
different.
PvE,
Yeah.
but if you look back at PvE games as well, I think people do enjoy finding weird little things, and the balance needs to be okay, like good enough, but like it doesn't need to be this perfect balance. Otherwise, you risk creating something boring.
Right. Okay.
And that's fundamentally at the heart of this. Is one of the biggest problems I guess they face is that for most people it's just kind of uninteresting.
Right. So obviously the game is going to be withdrawn. It would have been withdrawn by the time people listen to us here. Where do they go next? They're obviously not going to write off however many millions of dollars they've invested in it. They're going to have to pivot, so to speak. The obvious route forward is that they're basically going to make it free to play and rejig microtransactions. That's the kind of Occam's razor thing that's the most likely thing that's going to happen. Is there any other routes forward? Because I'm not even sure that's going to be the right way to handle this. Oliver, what do you think?
I think outside of free to play, the route forward is to not proceed with the project. I really
Okay.
think
It's that simple.
I think those are the two choices. I don't really see a way. I mean, I'm not even sure that free to play does a whole lot for you. I mean, I think that relaunching it, exposing it to a much larger group of players, that probably helps. But I mean, the games you're competing against are also free to play games for the most part.
Right.
He's talking about like Counter-Strike, Rocket League, games like this. I do think there's probably some merit in saying, hey, we tried and this game is not connecting with players. And maybe we just shouldn't, maybe we should just move on to new pastures. Or, I mean, I don't know what that means for the studio, obviously. And that would be very unfortunate if something was to occur there in a negative fashion. But yeah, I mean, I think free to play has to be the move. I think it has to be a game that needs to attract just a much wider audience than it did. When you saw those Steam stats, I mean, I saw that at one point yesterday, a couple days ago, 38 players were playing. I mean, it's just a really low player population. It's not sustainable for a multiplayer game like that to have a player population that low. Pretty much period, but certainly within the first week of release, it's just unheard of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there would have been a bellwether from the beta as to the success that was to come or not to come. John, what is the way forward here?
Man, that is tough because I think, like Oliver said, free to play is kind of the only thing they can realistically do that doesn't involve spending a lot of money. Right? Yeah. I mean, I also have to think at this point that maybe the Concord IP is poisoned. as well. Like, if you do anything else with them, like, imagine it just becomes a different sort of game. They go back to like, all of this stuff requires investment. I don't think there's any point in investing in this specific IP and these characters at this point, right? Unless they massively overhaul them in a very interesting, unexpected way.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see what else they can do there that doesn't involve that kind of big spend. Free to play seems like the only way to get it to use what they've built and put it back out there. But even then, though, what would the player base be like? You get more people trying it for sure, but it feels like it's just possibly too late now for that. I don't see how do you
There is an episode, I'm not sure if you saw it, Gamescom, but there's that television series from Amazon, I think, called Secret Level, that has, I think, 15 levels, 15 episodes that cover discrete games, and one of those episodes centers on Concord. I don't know whether that's going to be released, but certainly you'd think.
Oh, I hope so.
I certainly hope so.
I don't think you can not release it. That would be nuts.
Yeah.
But then again,
I mean, so many people worked so hard on that, I'm sure. I mean, you look at the production values for that series and it just seems pretty crazy, pretty impressive. But that will be a bit of a marketing push whenever that gets released, I think later this year. And also, presumably, because this is a live service title, you don't launch a live service title and then say, okay, guys, what do we do for levels? What do we do for new missions, characters, skins, whatever? They would have had a pipeline, right? For sure, a pipeline of new content that was in production. So it would be a shame to see that also lost. And for sure, I mean, if they could retool that into something that's commercially viable, they probably do have a pipeline of content that extends. Probably they had plans for the next year or so, I have to imagine, at least, of content that could be continued to be iterated on and developed and released.
Oh, one idea I suddenly had is they could just lean into this failure, like rewrite the characters, go in this way where, like, essentially they're characters in a failed video game. Try to break the fourth wall, just poke fun at their own, do something wildly unexpected and just, like, completely bizarre.
Like the Borderlands reboot,
kind of, but more so, like, really, like, it would be tough. Don't get me wrong. Doing that type of comedy is not easy, but I feel like there is a path where they essentially, like, own what happened to them in a weird way. And then they make something that people might find interesting, where it's like, oh, that's a weird direction to go. They want to see what it is. So there's possibly something there. There's one other thing to mention, Oliver. I saw a lot of people sort of saying, like, oh, this game took 8 years to make. And it does seem that that's not true. And that in reality, it was more like 4 years of development. So
still a lot of years.
It's still a lot. I mean, don't get me wrong. That's a lot. I did see a funny tweet, though, where somebody was like, what do you think? The budget of Concord. Do you think the budget of Concord is higher than the combination of every single, like, shmup ever made? And there is a good possibility that it might be.
But that's kind of assuming the $250 million budget that's been floating about. But yeah, it's a bizarre correlation, that's for sure. I don't know what's going to happen. I wish the developers well. I hope it does come back in a way that does find an audience. I think there is the kernel of something good there, and maybe free to play is the way forward. How it's going to sustain itself going forward, don't know. And obviously, I really do hope that this makes anybody looking to invest in live service games consider the options carefully, because this is kind of like effectively the worst case scenario you're looking at here.
Bungie,
and fundamentally, the game is not bad. It's a good game, I think. It's just not. It just doesn't really stand out. It just doesn't really excite. But a lot of things in there are actually super competent and well made, and a lot of people are having fun with it.
Just not enough.
And if this is what's going to happen with a game that, is pretty good, what's going to happen if your game isn't pretty good? That's kind of. I
was kind of reflecting on this over the past couple of days, and I think, like, you look at a title like Space Marine 2, which is a game that has significant multiplayer elements, has co-op elements built into it. You can basically play the entire game co-op, has some co-op missions. They're planning a horde mode at some point. You know, I mean, that game could be a great single player game, and it could be a game that you can access and play single player for a long time. And certainly based on what I played earlier of the beta code, of the preview code, seems like a very successful game from a single player perspective. But they also have this multiplayer mode on top of that, which presumably was not as resource intensive to develop as like a full discrete multiplayer title. And that could well be its own, you know, maybe it's its own breakout hit, or maybe it's successful on its own terms. But that just seems like a lower risk way of trying to approach this problem. But maybe that's not what people are after, because obviously you want that breakout hit, but you end up with, for every Helldivers, you end up with a Concord, I suppose.
Yeah. This got me thinking also about Bungie in the future, where they're focusing in on Marathon, and we've heard rumors that it's not testing well. People aren't responding well to it. And I will say, at least comparatively, the Marathon reveal trailer was interesting visually, and I think people liked that, but it sounds like the game itself maybe isn't what people want, and it makes me sad. That's a case where I kind of wish they would start to look at something like this and maybe reconsider what that is and actually try to make an actual Marathon game rather than whatever the extraction shooter that they are building.
Also fair games as well.
Yeah. Oh, there was Fair Games. There was so this is interesting that there was also Hyenas from Sega for that, which was canned before release. That's actually kind of similar to Concord. So we have two high profile, expensive examples of games that were in development that were just like shut down like right away.
Well, we've got three. We've got The Last of Us multiplayer.
Oh, yes, that's true. Although
from Sony.
That was probably less far along, but, man, I think it just shows that it ain't worth putting a ton of money into one of these kind of multiplayer games. And I think like doing it on a more reasonable scale, like I'd be curious to know what Helldivers 2 budget was, but I'd imagine it was much smaller than Concord. Can't say for sure, but like the thing with multiplayer stuff is like, until you know that it's actually a success, finding that balance between investing enough to make something that people like, but not investing so much where a failure like is a disaster. That seems like a very difficult formula to figure out.
Yeah, I'm just curious now about the failure conditions for The Last of Us, because, you know, think about it. You've got a mega IP behind it. You've got a well-beloved multiplayer mode out there in factions that people absolutely adored, and yet it didn't make it through to final production.
I think the reason is actually, it's less to do with, I think it would have sold well, would have been popular. I think it's more that Naughty Dog does not want to become a studio that supports that game, right? We know that those types of games require a gigantic amount of resources to keep running. And I think Naughty Dog probably looked at what that would take over the years and said, that's not what we want to do. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Which is why it's sad that they couldn't just release Factions 2.
Yeah.
Like it didn't need to be this gigantic live service thing, right? They let it go. The scope got too big, clearly, for what it was, and they don't want to support it. And we know they can support a multiplayer mode. So I feel like hopefully there's lessons there as well about like, don't scope your multiplayer things too big. Otherwise the risk of failure is really, really high.